Okay, welcome back to our Chapter 5 Evolution lectures. Today is all about classification. Uh, if you took a peek at these slides prior to listening to this video, you were probably like, whoa, what's happening? There's so many slides. And that's true because in the IB world, you are going to need to know a ton of classification. And it's just this like little tiny part, like a subunit in chapter 5, but it is very, very dense with information. So this lecture itself, the one you're listening to right now, is going to be relatively short and sweet, but I'm going to mention quite a few times that you should pause and write this down, but I'm not going to go through and like read every word to you. Most of these things you should be able to figure out on your own. It's just a matter of memorization, which is like kind of crummy, I know. So to start off, we are going to talk about kind of the way that we classify organisms, right, in just in general. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see it as we go through all these slides. The red box that is currently on domain is going to move all the way down to the bottom as we get more and more specific. So starting with domains, there are three main domains in life: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. So we are eukaryotes, right? So anything with a nucleus is a eukaryote. And then bacteria used to be encompassing everything, and then relatively recently, archaea became its own domain, and it is its own specific area of life itself. And the archaea bacteria are kind of like extreme bacteria, right? They live in extremely hot environments or salty. They survive in areas that most other bacteria would not be able to survive in. Moving into kingdoms, you'll notice that the prokaryotic kingdoms are kind of like underneath this black line right here, right? You have bacteria and you have archaea. So even though they're domains, they're also kingdoms. And then eukaryotes has been broken down even further. You've got plants, protists, fungi, and animalia. This stuff is probably relatively familiar to you, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. For phylums, this is like the next step on classification, getting a little bit more specific. So these are just examples of phyla that you would potentially need to know. So starting with the plants on the right-hand side, you've already done these, right? Bryophytes, phyllosynophytes, conifers, angiosperms, like you've seen these before. So this is just kind of recapping what you've already learned. And then for Animalia, you probably know what these organisms within these phylums are, but you're going to need to be able to match the organisms to the phylum. So Porifera, Cnidaria, Platyhelminthes, Annelida, Mollusca, Arthropoda, all of this we're going to get into, but this is just kind of like a brief overview of examples of phylum you're going to need to know. For the next three, I'm just sort of showing you that as we go through these levels, the groups become smaller. And as they become smaller, they become more closely related. So, an example, if you were in the phylum Chordata, that means that you have a spinal cord, and then that would include classes. So Chordata is like an umbrella term, and then the classes are a little bit more specific, but still kind of umbrella terms, right? You have amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals within that, and then you get even more specific and more specific and more specific until you get to the genus and species. So genus species is our naming system. It's a two-name naming system, and it's called binomial nomenclature. That is an absolute vocab word. You should absolutely write that down. Binomial nomenclature. Binomial two-name nomenclature, naming system. So an example would be Homo sapiens, right? So Homo meaning is the genus, a little bit more broad. And that term is always capitalized, and then sapiens, the species, is very specific. It's never capitalized. So If you are typing, and this is just like a rule of thumb, I will be taking off points if this is not done, just FYI. If you are typing binomial names, they have to be italicized, and if you're handwriting them, then they have to be underlined. They need to be specifically, altered in some way that makes it obvious that it is a scientific name. Now, taxonomy itself is this idea of classification. So there are 7 levels from domain to species, and then even beyond species, there is something called subspecies. So they are recognized, but it's sort of like a subdivision of species, so it's not its own separate level. So subspecies are the same species, but they don't interbreed with each other. But if there was no barrier like distance or, like a river or something, they could interbreed, the possibility is there. So the main reason we care about classification is because this system allows us to group organisms while also assigning unique species names. So this is helpful when we need to identify new species. We can kind of work with the classification system we've already created and help kind of fit it into the area and maybe help us realize maybe some common ancestors or work with the other organisms within its levels. Now, as we are getting into basically from here on out to the rest of this, I am not going to read you every single thing. I'm not going to go through every single thing because a lot of this is like pictures and just basic, straight up rote memorization that you guys are going to have to do. And it's like not beneficial for me to just like read you everything. So our first breakdown is the plants. So we have non-vascular plants and vascular plants. We've heard about most of these, right? So the like 2nd to 5th one you've heard about, mosses, ferns, pines, flowering plants. Chlorophyta we haven't talked about, but it's just aquatic algae, so like you know what it is, but it's also non-vascular. So each of these you can kind of see, there's going to be a picture for all of them. This is Chlorophyta. You should maybe pause and read things if you want, or just look at the slides afterwards. Mosses, you've got some key points about all of these organisms in like the box with like the appearance, the vasculature, reproduction. So key things that maybe you want to write down. And then vascular plants have vascular tissues. And so we've got ferns. Well, keep it for a second. We've got conifers. And we've got angiosperms. You've heard of all these, so I'm not going to spend any time on this, but you know this stuff. Now this is a great place to pause and write stuff down. So this is sort of like a table that covers what you just saw. So you have the appearance of them, you have their max size, and you have how they reproduce. So key pieces here would be your appearance and your reproduction. Would be worth either printing this out and putting it in your notes or writing it down yourself. Okay, next on the old to-do list is kingdom Animalia. But we're going to focus on invertebrates first. So this is strictly invertebrates. And then we're going to get into vertebrates. So we have Porifera, which is sponges, Cnidaria, which is jellyfish, Platyhelminthes, which is flatworms, Annelida, which is like segmented worms, like earthworms, Mollusca, which are snails, slugs, octopus, stuff of that nature, and then arthropods, which means they have an exoskeleton. So like insects, spiders, crustaceans, things of that nature. So again, we have these pictures and it has a lot of information on it. So I would suggest pausing and writing stuff down, or taking a minute on your own, I'm not going to read all this to you. Cnidaria, so again, jellyfish, anemones, platyhelminthes, flatworms, annelida, segmented worms. This is just another annelida. Mollusks, like a snail or a squid. Arthropods. So the first column is like the invertebrate categories themselves. Symmetry is kind of what you think symmetry is. So there's either no symmetry, there's radial, or there's bilateral. And if you have radial symmetry, it means that you have identical body halves around a central axis. Whereas bilateral symmetry means that you have symmetry along a sagittal plane. Basically, like if you were to put your hand straight together, like you were about to put like paper and rock, paper, scissors, right? And you put that where your thumb was touching your nose and your hand was up and down, you could split yourself along this plane, the sagittal plane, into a left and a right half. So bilateral symmetry means that you have identical left and right halves, and radial means that you can't split yourself into right and left halves, but you are showing symmetry along a central axis. So basically, like you have similar body parts around a central axis. The digestive tract is important. You should definitely note something about the digestive tract, whether they have a mouth or an anus or both. Segments, if they have them or they don't. And then other, so important. Definitely write something that makes them very specific to that invertebrate category. And then our vertebrates. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, so you should maybe pause and go through this, but some classes of vertebrates that we're going to talk about are fish. So the letters underneath are very specific traits of those vertebrates. Amphibians, so like frogs, right, where they start in the water when they're young and then they grow up and they get lungs and they can live on land. Reptiles like snakes and lizards. Birds, and then mammals. So all of these are very specific traits of these vertebrates themselves. Definitely worth taking a minute and writing this stuff down, pausing or going back, looking at the slides themselves, printing it out, whatever it may be. You should absolutely know these specific special pieces of each of these types of phyla. And the last thing we're going to talk about is a dichotomous key, which is like totally out of left field, right? But this was the last piece in this subsection. So a dichotomous key is where you have binary questions, meaning like yes or no, or like really you should only have two questions. So like 1A and 1B. And then from there you can identify an organism. So the way that this works is like if you're looking at bird W, right? You can see that there's differences, but if you're looking at only bird W, you would start at 1A or 1B. The beak is relatively long and slender, or the beak is relatively stout and heavy. Well, it looks kind of long and slender to me, so this italicized word would be its scientific name. And then you move on to the next bird, which is bird X. You start again back at 1, and you answer the same question. Is it long and slender or stout and heavy? Well, it looks stout and heavy to me, so I'm going to go to question 2. And then question 2 says the bottom surface of the lower beak is flat and straight, or the lower beak is curved. Well, the lower beak is curved to me, so I'm going to go to 3. And then the lower edge of the upper beak has a distinct bend or is mostly flat. So if you look at that, that looks like a straight line to me. So I'm going to say that it's mostly flat, which means that this platyspeza would be the scientific name of bird X. And then you just continue on answering the same questions for each of the birds that you're given or each of the organisms that you're given until you have identified all of them. And that's how you use a dichotomous key. Okay, we'll practice more in class, but again, I'm going to tell you that you really should go back and write down as much as you can about those phyla that we just talked about. They will absolutely show up in class and they will absolutely show up on your test. And they'll show up on the IB exam. It's a lot of information in a short time, but it's really important. Okay, I'll see you next time.